The penthouse was swallowing silence at 2:47 in the morning. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Las Vegas in electric blues and golds, the city sprawling like a circuit board beneath clouds that had not broken in 43 days. Luca Bianchi stood motionless in shadow, a man carved from the night itself. 6'2", shoulders broad enough to carry weight that most men would crumble under, dark hair silvered at the temples though he was only 41. The scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, a thin white line like a blade had once whispered across his face and decided to linger. He wore a black cashmere coat draped across his shoulders, the kind that cost more than a year of rent in the poorest districts of the city. His hands were steady. His eyes were not. Behind him, Carlo and Nino waited with the patience of men who understood that words were sometimes the most dangerous weapons. Carlo, the older one with grey in his beard and a Glock pressed against his ribs, had worked for Luca for 11 years. Nino, shorter and faster, had been there for 8. In all that time, they had never seen their boss afraid. Uncertainty looked strange on him. "She is leaving again," Luca said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. "Not a question. Never a question." Through the window on the east face of the penthouse, they could see the service entrance. And there, illuminated by the sick yellow glow of the underground parking garage lights, was Nora Reynolds. She moved quickly, almost furtively, dressed in a server's uniform, black pants, white blouse, apron still stained with what looked like red wine and desperation. Her hair, a dark brown the color of wet earth, was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already exhausted face taut. She was checking her phone. Her hands shook. The 14th time, Nino said quietly. "Always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Always for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. She returns with money in her pocket and sand in her hair." Luca watched her disappear into the darkness of the parking garage. The elevator doors slid shut like the closing of a confession booth. "In 3 weeks, she has been under this roof," Carlo said. His words came slowly, each one weighted with the gravity of what they implied. "And in 3 weeks, we have protected her. Fed her. Given her a place when she was sleeping in a car that died on Highway 15 during the worst storm this city has seen in a decade." "I know what I have done," Luca interrupted. Not angry. Worse than angry. Resigned. The night she arrived was etched into every surface of his memory. The convoy of black SUVs had been returning from a meeting with the Valdez family, a meeting that had threatened to tear apart an alliance that had taken 15 years to build. The rain had come like a judgment, sheets of water that turned the highway into a river of asphalt and chaos. And there, in a car from 2004, a Honda Civic that looked like it had already been surrendered to death, was a woman. She had been soaking wet. Her eyes were the color of winter, gray-blue and hollow with the particular exhaustion that comes from having nothing left to lose. When his men approached, she had not run. She had simply looked at them with an expression that said, "I am already drowning, so this changes nothing." Her name was Nora Reynolds. She was 28 years old but appeared to be carrying the weight of decades. Her husband had died 4 years prior, a factory accident, she explained, her voice like a candle in the wind, and the medical bills had devoured everything. Chemotherapy, surgery, funeral costs. She owed $47,000 to hospitals that would not negotiate. She had been evicted twice. She slept in her car and counted her money by the glow of gas station bathroom mirrors. And she had been clutching a photograph. Even now, 3 weeks later, Luca could see it in his mind. A Polaroid, faded and creased, showing a man with kind eyes and Nora's smile, younger, unmarked by grief. Her husband. The ghost she carried with her. Luca had done something he had never done before. He had brought her inside. "She is betraying you," Nino said, and the words hung in the air like a blade. "That is what this means. In your world, in this world, a woman who sneaks out at night while you sleep only does so for one reason. She is selling information. She is working with." "I know what it means," Luca said. The cold was creeping in from somewhere, not the air conditioning, which maintained a perfect 71 degrees. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that moved through bone and muscle and settled in the chambers of the heart. In Luca's world, betrayal had only one remedy. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. It was a bullet fired at close range and a body that disappeared into the desert before sunrise. He had made his empire from the ruins of a violent childhood. His father had been a capo in the old structure, a man who believed that power came from fear and that fear came from blood. When Luca was 9, his father had been executed in a parking garage by a rival family. Luca had watched from across the street. He remembered the sound it made, not like the movies. Quieter. Emptier. More like the universe deciding something permanent. His mother had raised him alone after that, working nights at a casino, coming home with exhaustion written into every line of her face. She had made him promise, with her dying breath when he was 23, that he would be better than his father. That he would build something that lasted. That he would be worthy of surviving when others did not. He had broken that promise every day for 18 years. But something about Nora Reynolds had made him want to keep it, at least for a moment. Something in the way she had looked at that photograph. Something in the fact that she had not asked him for anything. She had only needed shelter from the storm. She returns before dawn, Carlo observed, shifting his weight. Her exhaustion is not performance. Her fear is not calculated. I have watched her sleep. She clutches that photograph like it is the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Which means? Luca turned to face them, and his men stepped back involuntarily. In his eyes was something that neither of them had seen before, uncertainty and its twin, dread. Which means we do not know what she is doing, Carlo said carefully. But we know she is doing it because she believes she must. Not because she has chosen betrayal. There is a difference. Luca turned back to the window. The parking garage was empty now. The elevator was descending into the basement levels, and Nora Reynolds was disappearing into whatever darkness she ventured toward night after night. In 3 weeks, she had never returned smelling of alcohol or perfume. She had never come back with gifts for herself, jewelry, clothing, evidence of money being spent on anything but survival. Instead, she returned with sand. Always sand. An exhaustion that made her look like a soldier returning from a war she could never speak about. If she is meeting someone, Nino said slowly, then we find out who. We find out why. And if it is betrayal. If it is betrayal, then nothing changes, Luca said. His voice was not ice. It was something colder. But we will know the truth before we act. The decision had been made. The machinery of his world had already begun to turn. Within the hour, men would be following Nora Reynolds. Within the day, they would have names, locations, details. And then Luca Bianchi would have to make the choice that would crack open his empire and his heart simultaneously. But he did not know that yet. What he did know was that a woman who had slept in a car was sleeping in his penthouse now, in the guest room on the 3rd floor. And sometimes, late at night, he could hear her crying softly behind the closed door. The kind of crying that did not want to be heard. The kind that came from someone who had learned how to grieve in silence. He thought of his mother. He thought of the promise he had made her. And then he thought of breaking it one more time, because some people were worth the cost of breaking promises. The city lights reflected in his eyes like warnings nobody heeded. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Your support keeps these stories alive, and this one is far from over. But what Luca did not know was that Nora's midnight disappearances had nothing to do with betrayal. They had everything to do with a threat that walked on 2 legs and smiled behind a manager's desk. They had everything to do with a woman named Cordelia Blackwood who owned half of this city and believed that people like Nora Reynolds were invisible. They had everything to do with the fact that she was running out of time. 3 days remained on the foreclosure notice. $22,000 remained between Nora and losing her daughter completely. And every night, she walked into darkness to find a way to save a child who barely knew her anymore. Now let us go back to the beginning. Let us travel back 8 months, to a summer thunderstorm that changed everything, when a woman with $34 in her pocket and a dying car began the countdown to the worst night of her life. 8 months earlier, on a morning that tasted like desperation and tasted like rust, Nora Reynolds stood in the fluorescent brightness of a gas station bathroom mirror and counted her life in crumpled bills. $34. That was everything. Not a beginning. Not a middle. Just the thin line between surviving today and losing Emma tomorrow. She counted the money 3 times, her fingers trembling under the humming lights overhead, hoping the numbers would change. They never did. The bill stayed crumpled. The total stayed 34. Her hand stayed shaking. She was 29 years old but looked like someone who had already lived 2 lifetimes. Her hair, once light brown, had dulled to the color of old rope. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes like bruises that would never fade. She wore the same waitress uniform she had worn yesterday and the day before that, wrinkled linen the color of old cream, stained at the collar with coffee that belonged to other people. In the mirror's harsh light, she could see the person she had become, thin, worn, invisible. Behind her, through the bathroom door, she could hear the highway. 18-wheelers passing, their engines roaring like hungry animals. She had been living in her 2004 Honda Civic for 8 months now, parked behind a Walmart 3 miles from this gas station, moving it every few days so security would not notice. The Civic had 187,000 miles on the odometer and sounded like something dying a very slow death. Her daughter Emma was 7 years old. 7 years old and living in Phoenix with Nora's sister because Nora could not afford an apartment. Could not afford food for 2. Could not afford the life a child deserved. She had called Emma last Sunday from a borrowed phone, and Emma's voice had been small and careful, the way children speak when they are learning not to ask for things. "When are you coming home, Mommy?" Emma had asked. And Nora had said, "Soon, baby. Very soon." It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. The foreclosure notice was still in her backpack. She had read it so many times she could recite it backwards. $22,000. Due in 3 days. Her late husband's medical debt. Cancer that had taken him in 4 months and left behind a mountain of bills that nobody would forgive. Hospice care. Surgery. Medications that cost more per pill than Nora earned in a day. He was gone, but his debts lived on like a curse that could not be erased. She splashed water on her face and did not look in the mirror again. The Walmart parking lot stretched behind her like a concrete ocean. She had positioned the Civic in the back corner, near the loading dock where trucks came and went all night, where one more car would not attract attention. She kept everything she owned in the back seat, 2 changes of clothes, a photo of Michael before the cancer took his face, Emma's school picture, a blanket, and a box of granola bars that she rationed to 1 per day. She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed like a sick animal. Turned the key again. The cough became a wheeze. Again. Again. Nothing but grinding sounds and the smell of old oil. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and felt something cold move through her chest. Not quite fear. Something older. Something that came from living on the edge so long that falling off had started to feel inevitable. She had enough gas to drive to the restaurant in Las Vegas where she worked. She had enough money for 3 more days of food. After that, nothing. The foreclosure would be executed. She would lose the house that was already gone, already taken by the bank. And she would have no way to save Emma. She turned the key 1 more time and held it. The starter groaned and died. It was still dark outside, still early morning, that time when the world felt like it belonged to no one. The air hung thick and hot, even at 6 in the morning. Summer in the desert. The kind of heat that felt personal, like it was punishing her specifically. She grabbed her backpack and started walking. Las Vegas was a 3-hour drive. 47 miles on the highway. She walked for 2 hours before a trucker picked her up and drove her to the outskirts of the city, dropping her at a truck stop where she waited for hours for a bus that cost her $5 of her 34. By the time she reached the Cordelia restaurant and lounge, the lunch crowd was already gathering. Cordelia was a luxury establishment, the kind of place where the tablecloths cost more than her monthly rent used to cost. The kind of place where people who had never struggled came to drink cocktails that cost $20 each and tipped 2%. She changed into a fresh uniform in the staff bathroom and pinned her name tag to her chest, Nora. Just Nora. Not a mother. Not a widow. Not someone desperate. Just a name on a tag. For 12 hours, she moved between tables. She carried plates of food she could not afford to eat. She smiled at people who did not look at her. She watched the manager, Douglas Hale, a thin man in his 50s with teeth too white and eyes too bright, circling the restaurant like a shark in a sport coat, watching the servers, watching the register, watching the way tips accumulated in the shared pool. At the end of her shift, when she counted her station's earnings, she had made $41 in tips. $41 that would be split among 6 servers. That was $6.83 for 12 hours of standing on feet that burned and carrying plates that weighed more than hope. Douglas Hale counted the money in front of her and smiled that smile that meant nothing good. "Short tonight," he said. Not as a question. As a statement of fact and disappointment. People didn't tip well, Nora said. People tip well when servers make them feel welcome. He placed a single $10 bill on the counter. "That's your cut." He turned away before she could respond. Before she could say that $6 was not a cut. That $6 was an insult. That $6 meant she would eat one granola bar tonight and nothing tomorrow. The night descended like a lid closing. She had decided to sleep in the Civic outside the restaurant, where the lights from the parking lot made her feel slightly less alone. But she needed gas. She needed to drive to the highway outside the city, to a quieter place where security cameras were fewer. She had memorized the route. She had memorized which parking lots had blind spots. She drove with the windows down, letting the hot air blow across her face. The desert stretched on either side of her, endless and indifferent. This was Nevada. This was what surviving looked like when you had already lost everything that mattered. The highway opened up at 10 o'clock that night. The sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of stars you only saw far away from the city. She had always loved stars before. Before everything ended. Before she became someone who counted money in gas station bathrooms and lied to her 7-year-old daughter about coming home soon. She did not notice the weather changing at first. The wind picked up slowly, the way predators moved toward prey. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes, then 10 more. The stars disappeared behind clouds that rolled in from the north like an invasion. She was 43 miles outside Las Vegas, driving toward a rest area where she could park for the night, when the first drops of rain hit the windshield. Then more. Then the sky opened and rain fell like punishment. The rain came so hard she could barely see the road. Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough that she felt it in her bones. Lightning turned the world purple-white and then back to black. She slowed the Civic to 40 miles per hour, then 30, her hands locked on the steering wheel, her heart beating so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. And then the engine died. Just like that. In the middle of the highway during a thunderstorm, with rain hammering the car like bullets and nowhere to go and $34 in her pocket that meant nothing here. The Civic rolled forward on momentum, rolling toward the shoulder, rolling toward the edge, rolling toward the breakdown lane where she would be visible to every car that passed. She turned the key. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The thunder was so loud it seemed to come from inside her own chest. She sat in the darkness and felt the car being buffeted by wind, felt it rocking slightly as trucks passed on the highway, their headlights momentarily illuminating the interior of her world, showing her exactly how alone she was. 43 miles outside the city. No phone. No money for a tow truck. A foreclosure notice in her backpack and a daughter in Phoenix who was learning not to love her anymore because love required presents and Nora had nothing left to give. She put her head on the steering wheel and did not cry. She had learned not to cry. Tears were a luxury, like gasoline, an apartment rent, and the kind of life where you got to raise your own child. The headlights appeared through the rain like a question mark on the highway. Then another set. Then a third. The rain was so heavy she could barely see, but the headlights grew brighter, closer, slowing down. 3 vehicles. Large. Black. The kind of vehicles that belong to people with power and purpose and the ability to stop in the middle of a highway during a thunderstorm because the rules that governed other people did not apply to them. The convoy pulled up slowly behind her disabled Civic. She could see shapes moving through the rain, men in dark clothing, their movements efficient and practiced. She locked the doors and felt her breath come in short, sharp gasps. A figure approached her window through the downpour, water streaming off his shoulders. She could see the outline of his face but nothing more, backlit by the headlights of the vehicles behind him. He raised one hand and made a motion for her to lower the window. She did not. The figure waited. Patient. The kind of patience that came from never having to hurry or demand or raise his voice. He gestured again and said something, but the thunder swallowed his words. She lowered the window 2 inches. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough silk, the kind of voice that had given orders for so long that even questions sounded like commands. Even his concern sounded like a threat. "My car," Nora said. "It just died. I just need to. What is your name?" She did not know why she answered him. Shock, maybe. Or the kind of desperation that made you forget to be afraid because fear was a luxury too. "Nora," she said. Nora Reynolds. The figure was silent for a moment. The rain fell harder. A lightning bolt split the sky and she saw his face, 6'3", dark hair slicked back from his forehead, a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone like a permanent reminder of some violence long past. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her wonder if he could see through her skin to all the broken things underneath. "I'm Luca," he said. Just that. Just a name, offered like a gift or a threat. She would not know for hours which one it was. "Open the door." "I'm fine," Nora said. "Really, I just need a tow truck." She did not have anything. She had $34 and a foreclosure notice and a daughter who was forgetting her. She closed her mouth. Luca turned away and spoke to the men behind him in a language she did not recognize. Italian, maybe. The word sounded like poetry and violence. One of the men came forward with a tow hook. Another opened her door. "Get out," Luca said. "Not cruel. Just inevitable." She grabbed her backpack and stepped into the rain. The wind hit her immediately, cold and sharp, stealing her breath. Her thin waitress uniform was soaked in seconds. She was shaking, not from cold but from something else, something that lived deeper than temperature. Luca removed his jacket, a black coat that probably cost more than everything she owned, and draped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body. It smelled like expensive cologne and something darker, something she could not name. She was pulled toward the middle SUV, guided gently but with absolute certainty that she would obey. The interior was leather. Real leather. The kind that felt like a luxury that had a price beyond money. Luca sat across from her, close enough that she could see the scars on his knuckles, old scars and new ones, the evidence of a life lived in violence. "What were you doing on the highway in a storm?" he asked. Nora looked at her hands. At the calluses from years of waitressing. At the places where her wedding ring used to be before she sold it to make rent 3 months ago. "Driving," she said. "Where?" "Away." Luca studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if she had just confirmed something he already knew. As if he recognized in her the same thing she recognized in him, the look of someone who knew what it meant to lose everything and keep walking anyway. "Carlo," he called to the driver. "Take us to the estate." The SUV pulled back onto the highway, moving through the storm like it was nothing, like rain and wind and thunder were just noise, just weather, just obstacles that bent to the will of powerful men who had decided they would not be stopped. Nora sat wrapped in a jacket that cost more than her foreclosure notice and felt the world tilting. She did not know this man. She did not know where he was taking her. She did not know that the person sitting across from her had built an empire from the rubble of his own destroyed childhood. She did not know that he had promised his dead mother he would never be cruel to the desperate. She did not know that her presence in his life would cost him everything he had built. She only knew that the rain outside sounded like forgiveness and the car was warm, and for the first time in 8 months, nobody was asking her to smile or to move or to pretend that everything was fine. For the first time in 8 months, someone had stopped. The silk sheets felt like a lie against Nora Reynolds' skin. Thread count so high it probably had a name she couldn't pronounce. She woke at 6:19 in the morning in a bed the size of her entire car, and for 3 full seconds she forgot where she was. Then the floor-to-ceiling windows hit her like a slap. Las Vegas spread beneath her in gold and glass, an impossible light. The Strip glittered even in daylight, a scar of brightness across the desert. She could see the Bellagio fountains from here. She could see people the size of ants walking toward their own small tragedies. The bathroom was bigger than the Civic she'd been sleeping in for 8 months. A soaking tub carved from white marble. Heated floors. A rainfall showerhead that rained down like mercy. In the closet, and it was a closet the size of a bedroom, hanging clothes in her exact size. New clothes. Still tagged. Jeans that had never been worn. Sweaters that smelled like department stores instead of the used section at Goodwill. She put on yesterday's clothes instead. The fabric was thin in places from washing, but they were hers. They knew her body. That mattered. Luca Bianchi stood in the kitchen at 7:03 in the morning, and he was still wearing last night's shirt. White linen, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark lines of tattoos running up his forearms, a pattern like a scar, like a map of violence written in ink that cost more than Nora made in a month. He didn't look up when she entered. Just kept moving with the kind of deliberation that made you understand he was a man who had learned to control every single thing his body did. The espresso machine hissed. A thin stream of dark liquid fell into a small white cup. "You didn't have to do this," Nora said. Luca turned. His eyes were a shade of grey that looked like it held storms. "Do what?" "This. Any of this. The clothes. The room. I was stranded. That's all. You didn't owe me. You were stranded." He slid the espresso across the marble countertop toward her. "I helped. That is all. Men like you don't just help." His mouth tightened at the corner. "Men like me. Men who travel with armed guards and penthouses that cost more than most people make in a lifetime." She held his gaze. It was harder than it should have been. His eyes didn't blink. They just waited. You don't collect broken things just to be kind. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but a recognition. Like she had just said something true that he didn't expect her to know. "You are right. I don't." He turned back to the espresso machine. Steam rose like ghosts between them. "But you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "Myself. 20 years ago." Carlo appeared in the kitchen doorway then, careful and quiet like a man walking into something sacred. Behind him, Nino. Both of them in that peculiar stillness that comes from men trained in violence, now observing something they didn't understand. In 15 years working for him, Carlo would later tell the others, "I have never seen him sit beside anyone like this." Luca gestured for Nora to sit at the kitchen island. She did. The morning light from the windows was merciless and kind at once. It showed every place where she had worn down, the dark circles that had become permanent, the weight she'd lost, the way her hand shook slightly around the coffee cup. He told her about South Philadelphia. A neighborhood where the streets smelled like rust and broken promises. A father who drank the way other men breathed. A mother who loved him with the desperate strength of women who know they are running out of time. At 12 years old, Nora listened as Luca described the night his father hit his mother for the last time, and something in the boy had cracked open and become something else entirely. Something hard. Something that could not be broken the same way twice. I swore that night, Luca said, that no child would suffer like I suffered. That nobody would be left undefended. That the desperate would not be abandoned in the rain. And how many people have you saved with that promise? Nora asked. He looked at her directly. Until last night? None. The words hung between them like something that had just been created. She understood then, really understood, what it meant that he had stopped the SUV. That he had wrapped her in a coat that cost more than her foreclosure notice. That he had brought her to a place so far above her old life that it felt like another planet. I need money, Nora said. The words came out smaller than she intended. I need $22,000 in 3 days before they take my house. Before they take the only place my daughter has left that was ever really hers. I will pay it. No. You will let me help you, or I will help you anyway. Those are your choices. I won't be owned. She said it quietly, but the words landed like a hammer. I've been afraid my whole life. Afraid of losing things. Afraid of depending on people. I won't start now, even if it costs me everything. Something flickered across his face. Respect. Maybe. Or recognition. He nodded slowly, as though she had just passed some kind of test. There is a restaurant downtown, he said. The Cordelia Hotel and Restaurant. They are always hiring. The pay is better than most places, and the tips can be good if you work the right shifts. Nora wrote down the address with a pen that probably cost more than a week's groceries. She held it like it was a lottery ticket. What neither of them knew was that the Cordelia was owned by Cordelia Blackwood, a woman whose cruelty wore diamonds and smiled like it had earned the right. 3 days later, Nora stood on the marble floor of the Cordelia's dining room. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls. Soft carpeting swallowed footsteps. The air smelled like expensive food and old money. Douglas Hale was 42 and built like a man who had never done anything harder than point at things and make other people move them. Slick back hair. Cheap cologne that could not cover the smell of sweat. A smile like a shark sensing blood in the water. You will work doubles, he said. Monday through Friday, lunch and dinner service. Breaks are 10 minutes. Tips go in the jar. We distribute at the end of the week. Nora nodded. What happened was a mathematics problem with only bad answers. The first week, she worked 72 hours. Her feet swelled so badly she could barely fit them back into her shoes. The checkered floor stayed sticky under her shoes no matter how many times she cleaned it. The neon open sign buzzed overhead like a dying insect. At 3 in the morning, during the graveyard shift, the restaurant was all empty booths and fluorescent silence. Just her and the sound of ice clinking in abandoned glasses. Douglas watched from the office. Always watching. When she emptied the tip jar at midnight on Friday, she had collected $120. Douglas took the jar, counted it slowly in front of her, and handed her back $36. House fee, he said, and smiled. That's 70%, Nora said. That's the deal. You want to keep this job? She nodded because she had no choice. Then shut up and smile. He stepped close enough that she could smell his breath. Tobacco and coffee. His shadow fell across her face. You're lucky I'm giving you anything at all. You should see the way you look. Most customers complain about waitresses who look like they're dying. Behind him, through the office window on the second floor, Cordelia Blackwood sat at her mahogany desk, perfectly manicured nails tapping against the phone. A diamond necklace caught the light from the chandelier. She watched Nora's face break. She smiled at that breaking, the way some people smile at sunsets, appreciating something beautiful in its destruction. Nora came back to the penthouse at 5:17 in the morning after the first double shift. Her feet left wet marks on the marble floors. Luca was awake, which meant he probably hadn't slept. He was reading something in Italian on a leather chair that faced the city. When he looked up at her, his expression didn't change, but something in his chest did. "You look half dead," he said. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You are holding onto the wall. You look like the wall is the only thing keeping you from falling." He stood. "Come. Sit." He made her eat bread and cheese and fruit. Real food, not the scraps she'd been stealing from the Cordelia's kitchen. She sat at the kitchen counter and felt her hands shaking around a glass of water. "Why are you killing yourself like this?" Luca asked. Nora didn't answer for a long time. Then the dam broke. "My husband died 18 months ago. Cancer." The surgery was $47,000. The chemotherapy was $200,000. The hospital bills, her voice cracked. "We had insurance, but insurance has limits. We hit those limits somewhere around midnight on a Tuesday. After that, every treatment was just us hemorrhaging money we didn't have. He died anyway." She stopped talking. Luca waited. The house went into foreclosure for the remaining $22,000. They sent a notice 3 days ago. 90 days to pay or they take everything. My daughter has her father's ashes on the mantel in her bedroom. If they take the house, I don't know where those ashes go. I don't know where she goes. I have exactly $890 after 2 weeks of working 70-hour weeks. I will pay the debt, Luca said. "No. You will let me help you." "Why would you help me? I am nobody. I'm a widow with a dead husband's ashes and a daughter who's old enough to understand that her mother is failing. I'm nobody." Luca leaned forward. The grey of his eyes deepened. "Because somebody should have helped me when I was nobody. Because the people who did this to you believed you were nobody, and that belief needs to be corrected." Behind them, in the hallway, Carlo and Nino stood frozen. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of Luca Bianchi's world. Something that couldn't be unshifted. 2 weeks in, Douglas locked the restaurant doors during Nora's breaks. 10 minutes became 5 minutes became none at all. He forced her to work through her lunch. At night, he made her clean the grease traps alone while he watched from the office above, his shadow sliding across the tile floor like something with malice. "You want to complain," he said once, standing too close while she scrubbed on her knees. "I will call the police. I will tell them you've been stealing from the register. I will plant cash in your bag. Who do you think they'll believe? A man who owns a 5-star restaurant, or a desperate homeless woman?" Cordelia Blackwood came to the restaurant on Friday night with friends from the country club. Nora was carrying a tray of champagne when Cordelia caught her eye and smiled that smile again, the one that meant pleasure in cruelty. "The help these days," Cordelia said to her table, loud enough for Nora to hear. "So desperate they will do anything. You can see it on their faces. The desperation. It's like a stain that won't wash out." The women laughed. It was a specific kind of laughter, the kind designed to make sure the person being laughed at knew exactly how much less they mattered. Nora's hand trembled. The champagne flute on her tray rattled against its neighbors. She touched the photograph in her apron pocket, her husband's face, frozen at 34 years old, forever smiling at a camera on their honeymoon. That was 14 years ago. He had never gotten older than that smile. That night, she counted her money again. After 4 weeks of working 72-hour weeks, with Douglas stealing 70% of her tips, she had made $1,420 total. She needed $22,000 in 56 days. The math was impossible. The kind of impossible that doesn't get better with thinking about it. What Nora didn't know was that Luca Bianchi had started making calls. Quiet calls. The kind of calls that move through an underground network like water finding every crack. What she didn't know was that he had asked about the Cordelia. About its ownership. About the pattern of missing money in its accounts, the workers who quit and never came back, the woman in the office upstairs who smiled while other people drowned. What changed everything was the moment Marco walked into the penthouse at 11 p.m. on a Friday night and handed Luca a file. Inside that file was evidence of a crime so systematic it had become invisible. Embezzlement. Wage theft. Coercion. All of it leading upward, branching like a tree toward Cordelia Blackwood, who sat in her office and smiled while the world consumed itself. Luca opened the file. He read each page. Then he made a choice that would cost him more than $22,000. It would cost him his entire empire. He picked up the phone and called the federal investigators. The neon lights of Murphy's Diner hummed their tired song at 3 in the morning, casting everything in shades of sickly yellow and green. The checkered floor, black and white squares worn smooth by thousands of footsteps, reflected Nora Reynolds' face back at her, and what she saw there made her stomach clench. Hollow eyes. Greasy hair plastered to her scalp. The uniform that smelled like fryer oil and broken promises. She sat in the corner booth, the one the other waitresses avoided because the heating vent didn't work, and spread the bills across the Formica table. 100. 50. 20. 10. 5. 1. She arranged them by denomination, counting for the 20th time, her hand shaking so badly the paper rustled like autumn leaves caught in a windstorm. $1,247. She needed $22,000. By 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The rain hammered against the diner windows with the sound of thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. Outside, the Las Vegas night sprawled dark and indifferent, the kind of darkness that doesn't care how hard you fight. Nora's phone sat next to her money on the table. The screen was cracked from when she had dropped it last week, a hairline fracture that spread across the glass like a scar. The photograph was tucked inside her apron pocket, the edges soft from being touched so many times. She pulled it out and laid it on the table next to the money. Her husband, Marcus, frozen at 34 years old, forever smiling at a camera on their honeymoon in Puerto Rico. That was 14 years ago. He had never gotten older than that smile. He had stopped aging when the aneurysm took him while he slept. Stopped breathing. Stopped being. Stopped everything except the part of him that lived in Emma's eyes and in Nora's chest as a weight that never lightened. She whispered to him the way she did when she was desperate. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. The rain answered. The clock answered. The silence answered. 3 blocks away, in a penthouse that rose above the city like a modern cathedral of glass and steel, Luca Bianchi sat in his study reading a file. The leather chair was Italian, handcrafted, worth more than Nora's car. The desk was mahogany, polished to a shine that reflected the city lights below. Everything in this room spoke of power and untouchable wealth, except for the man himself, who looked like he was reading his own death sentence. The file had been delivered by Marco, his oldest lieutenant, at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. Marco, who had been with Luca for 18 years, who had never seen him flinch, who had watched him order men's deaths with the same tone one might use to order coffee. Tell me I'm wrong, Luca said, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. Marco stood by the window, looking out at the lights of the city that Luca owned. Not owned, controlled. There was a difference. I wish I could. The file contained 4 weeks of investigation. Carlo and Nino, his 2 best men, had spent every waking hour following threads. They had found the pattern immediately. It was written in the accounts of the Cordelia Hotel like a confession carved into stone. 16 women in 5 years. All of them desperate. All of them vulnerable. All of them trapped in a system that fed on their desperation like a machine designed for no other purpose. Douglas Hale, the restaurant manager, had stolen over $200,000 in tips and wages. But the money wasn't the crime, it was the mechanism of the crime that turned Luca's chest cold. Wage theft. Extortion. Coercion. Locking women in storage rooms for taking bathroom breaks. Threatening to have them arrested for theft if they reported him. Targeting waitresses whose families were struggling, whose desperation made them compliant, whose silence could be purchased with the threat of homelessness. Cordelia Blackwood, the owner of the hotel, sat in her office upstairs and smiled while it all happened. She knew. The encrypted files made that clear. She protected Douglas because he funneled cash to her under the table. She was complicit in every theft, every threat, every violation. She was also a member of the Las Vegas Country Club. She served on 3 charity boards. She donated to political campaigns. She was woven into the fabric of legitimate society in a way that made her untouchable. Until tonight. Luca closed the file. What changed everything was the moment he understood that some things mattered more than keeping his own world intact. "You're going to call them," Marcos said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. The FBI will come into this building. They will ask questions. They will. I know what they will do." Marco turned from the window, and Luca saw something in his lieutenant's face that might have been fear, or might have been the beginning of understanding that the man he worked for had just chosen something that would destroy everything he had built. The phone on the desk was black, encrypted, untraceable. Luca picked it up and dialed a number he had kept for emergencies. A voice answered on the 3rd ring, cautious, expecting a crisis. "I have evidence of a systematic labor trafficking operation," Luca said. "I'm sending it to you. The victims are still working there. One of them needs immediate protection." Nora was still sitting in the diner booth when her phone buzzed at 3:45 in the morning. It was a text from an unknown number. "You are safe. Do not go to work. Do not leave your car. Someone will find you." She read it 3 times, her brain unable to process the words, unable to make sense of how the universe could know she was drowning. She opened her phone to call Luca, to ask him if this was him, but she already knew. He was the only person who could move the world that fast. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the FBI arrived at the Cordelia Hotel. 12 agents in Navy windbreakers moved through the building like ghosts. There was no warning. No courtesy call. Just the sound of a battering ram striking the office door, the crack of wood splitting, and then agents streaming through the restaurant where Nora had poured coffee and been invisible. Douglas Hale stumbled out of his apartment above the restaurant wearing only boxers and an undershirt stained with sweat. He was 47 years old, balding, with the soft body of a man who had spent years taking whatever he wanted because he believed nothing could stop him. When he saw the badges, his face went the color of old paper. "What is this?" he asked, but his voice already knew the answer. "Douglas Marcus Hale, you are under arrest for racketeering, labor trafficking, wage theft, extortion, and conspiracy," an agent said, reading from a card without emotion. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He didn't resist. He didn't run. He collapsed to his knees right there on the carpet, trembling like a cornered animal, begging with a voice that broke on every word. "I can pay. I can give you names. I can give you everything. Please. Please, you don't understand. I can fix this." They didn't answer. They cuffed him. Read the rest of his rights. He was screaming by the time they led him away, a sound that came from the part of him that suddenly understood that his world had ended. Meanwhile, 12 miles away, Cordelia Blackwood was at her country club having brunch with 4 women who had been her friends for 20 years. She was wearing a Chanel suit that cost $3,000 and a diamond necklace that had been in her family for 3 generations. She was laughing at something someone had said about a mutual acquaintance's divorce when FBI agents walked into the dining room. They moved toward her with the kind of purposeful silence that made the entire room go still. "Cordelia and Blackwood," an agent asked, holding up a badge. She stood up, her napkin falling to the floor. "There's obviously been a mistake. I'm on the board of. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit labor trafficking, money laundering, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice." The agent took her arm. She tried to pull away, her voice rising. "Do you understand who I am? Do you understand what you are doing? My lawyer will destroy you. This is a mistake. This is." They cuffed her right there, in front of her friends, in front of the people she had built her entire identity around impressing. The camera phones came out. The video started uploading. Within 20 minutes, her arrest was being watched across Las Vegas. Within an hour, every major news outlet had picked up the story. By noon, she was the headline. The encrypted files they found on Douglas's computer linked directly to Cordelia's offshore accounts. She had been skimming money from the hotel for 6 years. The evidence was systematic, documented, undeniable. She had protected Douglas because he was profitable. She had let him destroy women because their destruction was profitable. At 6 o'clock that evening, Nora sat in the safe house the FBI had arranged, a small apartment in a neighborhood that didn't matter, and watched the news reports on a television that had been turned on for her. Douglas Hale was being held without bail, facing 40 years in federal prison. Cordelia Blackwood's country club membership had been revoked within hours of her arrest. Her lawyer had released a statement saying she was cooperating fully with investigators. Both of them were going to lose everything. Nora pulled out the photograph of Marcus. She held it in both hands and pressed it against her chest. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "Emma's going to be okay." Her phone buzzed. A text from Luca, "Rest. Tomorrow, we make sure you never have to count coins again." The storm was passing. Outside the safe house windows, the rain was finally stopping, and the first light of morning was beginning to crack across the darkness, revealing a sky that had turned pale and clear, as if the night had been washed away and forgotten, leaving only the promise of a day when she would finally catch her breath. The 7 o'clock morning news broadcast flickered across the diner's mounted television, and Nora Reynolds stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot suspended in her trembling hand. The volume was low, muffled beneath the clatter of breakfast plates and the hiss of the kitchen, but the headline running across the bottom of the screen was crystal clear: "Luxury hotel manager arrested in wage theft conspiracy." Douglas Hale's mugshot filled the screen. His face, the same face that had smiled while he pocketed her tips, while he locked the employee bathroom door and made her beg to use the toilet, while he told her no one would believe her anyway, that face was now stamped across every news outlet in Nevada. The coffee pot slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the tile floor, sending brown liquid spreading like a map of all the nights she had survived on nothing. A customer flinched. The manager didn't look up. None of them understood what they were witnessing. Nora's hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the edges of the counter. She had watched from that safe house yesterday as the FBI moved in. She had heard the sirens. But seeing it on the news, seeing Douglas Hale in handcuffs, seeing the words federal charges and 40-year sentence printed in white letters beneath his broken expression, something inside her chest fractured and reformed all at once. The news anchor's voice cut through the diner noise, evidence of systematic exploitation spanning 6 years. Co-conspirator Cordelia Blackwood, owner of the Cordelia Hotel, was arrested this morning on charges of money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit wage theft. According to the FBI statement, Ms. Blackwood allegedly enabled the abuse of dozens of employees. Cordelia. That name hit differently. The woman who had watched from her office. The woman who had smiled when Douglas humiliated her. The woman who had known exactly what was happening and had chosen her profit margins over human dignity. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text message. She knew before she read it who it was from. The screen glowed. "Turn on the television. What you are seeing is real." Nora's breath caught. She stepped into the storage room, away from the diner's fluorescent lights, and called the number that had saved her life on a rain-soaked highway 48 hours ago. Luca Bianchi answered before the first ring finished. "Did you?" Nora's voice was barely audible, fractured like thin ice. "Yes." "Why?" The question tumbled out before she could stop it. "You risked everything. Your empire. Your men. Why would you?" Silence. Not empty silence. The kind of silence that holds weight, that means someone is choosing their next words with the precision of a surgeon selecting a blade. When Luca spoke again, his voice was steady, deep, and solid like an oath. "Because I could. And because you deserved better than what they did to you." Nora sank onto a box of napkins, her legs no longer capable of holding her upright. I lost my job. Come home. That word, home, detonated something in her chest. Home. A place she hadn't had since her Civic became her address. A place she had stopped believing existed for people like her. I'm sending Carlo to pick you up, Luca continued. 20 minutes. Pack nothing. Everything you need is already here. The line went dead. When Carlo arrived, he didn't speak. He was the same broad-shouldered man with the scar running from his right eye to his jaw who had been present at the safe house. His suit was black, immaculate, worth more than Nora's monthly rent. He simply opened the passenger door of the black SUV, and she climbed inside, still wearing her diner apron, still carrying the smell of coffee and grease on her skin. The drive through Las Vegas took 15 minutes. Nora watched the city transform around her, the lower neighborhoods with their flickering neon signs and boarded windows giving way to residential streets, then to estates that sprawled like kingdoms. The black gates surrounding Luca's penthouse appeared ahead like the entrance to another world entirely. He was standing by the windows when she entered, silhouetted against the morning light spilling across the Las Vegas Strip. 38 years old, his tailored charcoal suit unmarked, his dark hair silvered slightly at the temples, his presence commanding the entire penthouse the way a general commands a battlefield. But it was his eyes that stopped her, storm gray, penetrating, and now watching her with something that looked almost like tenderness. The FBI found the money he stole from you, Luca said without preamble. Every tip. Every shift. Every dollar he pocketed while you went hungry. It was documented in his system. He was meticulous. He kept records. He extended an envelope. Her hands moved before her mind could process what was happening. Inside was a cashier's check. $22,000. The exact amount she had been told she owed to keep her house. The amount that had felt impossible, mythological, a number that belonged to other people's lives. I cannot, Nora whispered. It is not charity, Luca interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade. It is what you earned. What Douglas stole from you. The FBI recovered it from his accounts. It is yours. Legally. Completely. You have the federal paperwork. She looked at the check. Her name. Nora Reynolds. $22,000. The number refused to feel real. You called the FBI, she said quietly. You could have handled this yourself. You could have disappeared Douglas Hale in a way that would never make the news. I could have, Luca agreed. But you didn't. No. Nora's eyes lifted to meet his. Why? Luca turned back toward the window, his jaw tightening. When he spoke, his voice carried something raw, something that had been buried under layers of violence and empire for longer than he could remember. I built an empire on fear. On the understanding that I was willing to hurt people and most people were not. That imbalance became my advantage. My wealth. My power. He paused, his hand resting against the glass. But you reminded me of something I had forgotten. Or perhaps something I had chosen to forget. Survival does not require becoming the thing that tried to destroy you. The room held its breath. You were destroyed, he continued, and you chose mercy anyway. You chose to let the system handle this instead of asking me to handle it in blood. That kind of strength, that is not something you survive. That is something you honor. Nora felt the photograph in her apron pocket, the one she had carried since the night of the storm. Marcus. Her late husband with his gentle eyes and his patient smile, the man who had taught her that power without kindness was just cruelty wearing expensive clothes. I loved someone like you once, she said. I thought I would never meet anyone like him again. Luca turned from the window. His expression was unguarded, unarmored. And now? Now I think maybe the world has more good in it than I believed. At that moment, Carlo and Nino appeared in the penthouse doorway, having brought up her few belongings from the safe house. The two lieutenants exchanged a look, The kind of look that passes between men who have worked together for 15 years and understand each other without words. In that glance was the recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The man they served, the man who had built his empire through calculated ruthlessness, who had never shown vulnerability, who had never hesitated to make brutal decisions, that man had just chosen mercy. Over power. Over revenge. Over the code that had defined his life. Nino withdrew silently, but in the hallway, he turned to Carlo and said quietly, "In all our years, I have never seen him like this." Carlo nodded. He has been waiting for her since the moment she stumbled into the rain. The storm that had raged against the city for 2 days was finally passing. Outside the penthouse windows, the rain was stopping, and the first light of clear morning was beginning to crack across the darkness, revealing a sky that had been washed clean, stripped of everything except possibility. But what both Luca and Nora were about to discover was that redemption is not about erasing the past. It is about refusing to become it. 6 months later, Nora stood in the living room of a small house in a neighborhood where children played in yards and flowers bloomed in careful rows. 7-year-old Emma was in the kitchen, coloring a picture with markers, her small voice humming a song she had learned at school. Nora's house. The one she had thought she would lose. The one that was hers again, purchased cleanly, legally, with money she had earned through her own labor and through the courage to ask for help. She had taken a position at a non-profit that Luca funded, an organization dedicated to helping homeless women find housing, legal aid, and job training. Every story she worked with mirrored some version of her own. Every woman she helped was herself, standing in a gas station bathroom at 3 in the morning, counting coins like prayer beads, wondering if surviving another day was worth the cost. Once a week, on Thursday nights, she and Luca had dinner at the late-night diner where she had stood frozen, watching the news report of Douglas Hale's arrest. The same checkered floor. The same dying neon lights in the windows. The same stale smell of coffee and grease hanging permanent in the air. They sat in a booth in the corner, away from the handful of other customers, 2 people who had clawed out of darkness and had chosen to carry light back for others still trapped inside. Luca still ran his empire, but he had started asking different questions. How to build without destroying. How to protect without terrorizing. How to inherit violence and refuse to pass it forward. On this particular Thursday, the summer air was turning warm again, and through the diner windows, Nora could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The kind of storms that moved through the desert with purpose, leaving everything changed in their wake. She pulled out the photograph she always carried, Marcus, her late husband, his eyes kind and patient even frozen in time. She slid it across the table to Luca. "Look at him," she said. "Look at his face." Luca studied the photograph. The man in the image had a gentleness that no amount of hardship had erased. An inherent decency. A belief that people deserved kindness. "He would have liked you," Nora said. "Why?" Luca asked, though he already knew. "Because you chose the hard thing when the easy thing was all you knew. Because you looked at someone who was nobody to the world and you decided she was worth something. Because you learned that survival doesn't mean you have to become a monster." Luca set the photograph down carefully, as though it contained something fragile and precious. "I regret many things about my life. But I do not regret calling the FBI. I do not regret choosing you." Outside, the first lightning crack split the sky. Thunder followed, deep and rolling like a warning. The summer storm was arriving with intensity, rain beginning to fall in heavy sheets against the diner windows. Nora watched it and remembered a different storm, the one on the highway when her Civic died, when she had thought her life was ending but had actually been beginning. She remembered the convoy of black SUVs emerging from the rain like an answer to a prayer she didn't know she was allowed to pray. Luca saw her watching the storm. He stirred his coffee, which had grown cold, and said the words that would stay with her forever: "The storm will pass and you are far stronger than you think." Nora nodded. She knew it now. They both did. The people who survive the darkness have a choice, to spread it or to carry light back for others. Luca Bianchi and Nora Reynolds had chosen light. Not because it was easy, but because someone had to. If this story touched your heart, please drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story about survival, redemption, and the choices that define us. Comment below, what would you have done in Nora's position? We read every single one. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video.